Welcome to another episode of this podcast. We're on episode 3. The first 2 episodes have focused on Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. This episode is a change of direction, change of genre. It's going to be Quake. To honor my late friend who had inspired this series, Quake is certainly a seminal first-person shooter of the mid-90s. It's easy to take for granted all of the conventions that the game has established. I think there's an entire generation that has not even heard of Quake, let alone played it. But I have very deep-seated memories tied to that game. I wouldn't even say that it's my favorite first-person shooter, but I remember back in the day, my friend in question telling me about Quake. Of course, we had played Doom 1 and 2 already. It was the next big thing from id Software. My friend really liked the main character, whose name is Ranger. I think he liked the look, the portrait of the character. He's more chunky looking, not fat, but looking more like a tight end or offensive or defensive lineman as opposed to the poster boy quarterback. And I think that look had appealed to my friend, who kind of had a similar appearance. I think I played the game about within a year. Obviously, there was a lot of hype surrounding that game because it was the follow-up to the first 2 Doom games. id Software was certainly on a hot streak. I played a version that a classmate of mine burned onto a disc for me, and I played it on the family Pentium computer. Now, with all due respect to Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails, I didn't really listen to the original soundtrack. I actually played it with an audio CD in the computer, and it played while I was playing the game. And that album was the first album I ever bought, 16 Stone by the rock band Bush. And besides the signature sound of the ogre grenades bouncing off of walls and floors, whenever I think of that game, I think of the end mission, the end level screen, and how a certain song would play always at that screen. And that song is bomb. I'll link to it. It's great. I think somehow the programming of the game was such that at certain screens or whatever, certain tracks would play. And as I understand, the original Quake CD has something similar. Like if you take the game CD and put it into a CD player, each track is like a different track of the soundtrack. I feel kind of bad saying that, all the effort that Trent Reznor put into the game. Certainly he left his mark on the game visually. The nail gun and super nail gun, the ammo boxes have the 9 Inch Nails logo. Even then I'd known about that, even though I've never really listened to any of their music. Although I appreciate the soundtrack work, the movie scores that he's done, especially The Social Network. I know that Trent Reznor is a huge gaming fan. I remember reading in a gaming article about how he would go to game stores and drop down several $100s at a time, and how his bandmates would be really into competitive games amongst each other, and they wouldn't talk to each other for days just because they got so into it. Yeah, Quake. That's my core memory. Just playing the game. Of course, the biggest innovation of Quake would be its 3D graphics. It was the first game to have truly 3D environments and objects. Looking at it now, it's very rudimentary, but it's just, I can't really state in words just how evolutionary it had been. Certainly, compared to Doom, there's also a lot more verticality. In the Doom games, you can run and jump, but in Quake, you can actually look up and down and aim manually. In fact, you have to in order to progress. Some points you've got to shoot at switches and such. And there's also underwater sections, wading and swimming through waste, liquid waste, radioactive material in addition to water. There's boss fights. I don't remember Doom having like dedicated boss arenas. Maybe at the end of Doom 2. Yeah, let's look at my notes. 4 episodes, each designed by a different person on the Quake team. I'll go into more detail about the development. It really is a fascinating story. But I think I only ever beat that first episode. I really distinctly remember that boss fight. I can't remember the character's name, but it's this giant that emerges from this pool of lava, and the player has to hit these floor switches to lower these prongs and then step on a floor panel to send a current between those 2 prongs and shock that demon. Then after the release of Quake, the original campaign with 4 episodes, a year later or so, there were 2 official mission packs, DLC, back before it was called DLC. I never played them at the time. I only played it more recently when I got the anniversary edition for the PS4. Scourge of Armagon, Dissolution of Eternity. Those were the 2 original official mission packs. Expansions. Yeah, they were called expansions back in the day. And then Dimension of the Past, Dimension of the Machine. Those are more contemporary, released in 2016 and 2021, respectively. But the core gameplay of Quake is timeless. Just jumping right in, strafing, jumping, jump strafing, rocket jumping. That game introduced that system. I won't even get into Team Deathmatch. I was never really an online player in the period, but rocket jumping, competitive online play for more than 4 people at a time, co-op campaigns. I feel like it's really, I wouldn't say underrated. Maybe it's not quite to say. Maybe it's not quite as appreciated as much by the younger generation. People born after the turn of the millennium or just before it. People who would not have been old enough to play Quake at the time of its release. But I will say, yeah, so I did play it more recently. I got the Anniversary Edition HD release a few years ago. But to be honest, I couldn't really play it without something else going on. Like I would play it while listening to a podcast or sort of watching a stream. It's really easy to pick up. I did get the Platinum Trophy finally. Going through all those episodes, being it on Nightmare mode, which is really the standard mode, except your health can never go beyond 50 health points. I think definitely save scumming is a godsend. I know the ports released after the original PC game didn't even allow level saving. You have to like complete a level in order to be able to save your progress, and I can't even imagine doing that. I was really impressed with the later episodes, the more contemporary designed ones. They're so inventive, even with the technical limitations of the engine. Just the creative direction, the art direction is so cool. It's like the basis of Quake is timeless. It's trite to say, but it's true. And one thing that I've almost forgotten is how Quake really kickstarted the whole practice of having dedicated graphics cards, external aftermarket graphics cards used to enhance the visuals and gameplay, the smoothness of computer games. I say that now as I've got external GPU connected to my Intel-based Mac. I don't really play games on this Mac, but if I wanted to, I could, in theory. If it worked in Windows, that is. But just that whole industry that's emerged, NVIDIA, AMD, that's their bread and butter. Well, big chunk of their business. They're multi-billion-dollar companies. I think NVIDIA is a multi-trillion-dollar company now. And you can kind of trace it back all to Quake. John Carmack with his coding innovations. And I'll get into that more. But Quake is playable today. Although I can't really recommend it to somebody who's not already a die-hard fan of first-person shooters, and someone who doesn't have someone to go through the campaign with them. You probably have to do what I did and just kind of play it with a show playing in the background or something, because it's just not stimulating enough by today's standards. There's no story. It's just like a series of text screens at the end of episodes, which is understandable because that would have been the way that people did things in that time. Yeah, the game is pretty cool. I have not played Quake 2, Quake 3, or I think there's a Quake 4. I'm not even sure. I think a big part of the reason why Quake is kind of always in the shadow of Doom is because it did release after those two Doom games. But there's no continuity from one game to the next. Like the tone and the features are so different. There's no persistent universe like Half-Life or Halo or even Call of Duty. Other content creators have gone into more detail about the development and impact of the Quake game, so I won't dive too much into the content that they've mentioned, but I'm just trying to see here the Quake games. Quake series. So yeah, I know Quake 2 is like, so Quake, the original Quake has this like very almost medieval style setting. It's a combination of near future military themes, but it blends fantasy, medieval, castle, dungeon environment because of some interdimensional travel. Then Quake 2 is heavily inspired by The Guns of Navarone, the movie, the classic starring Gregory Peck, that had also been inspiration for the Metal Gear series. And then Quake 3 had been multiplayer only. Quake 4, there's got to be a Quake 4. Is there a Quake 4? Quake 3 Arena. Okay, there's never been a Quake 4. Actually, no, wait. There was a Quake 4. What was Quake 4? Okay, so it continues the story of Quake 2. That shows you how much I know about the Quake series. And then there's Quake Territories, Enemy Territory, Quake Wars, Objective Focused Team Oriented Game. That was 2007, so we're talking like 18 years ago, 17, 18 years ago. Yeah, whereas Doom, even though the universe is a bit more tenuous, the main character, who's now known as the Doomslayer, is more iconic. I know Doom Eternal had fleshed out the lore more, though I've never played it. I don't know if I want to. Some people say that the storytelling elements in Doom Eternal aren't so great, but at least there's like something to work with if you're a story designer, whereas with Quake, it's just so all over the place. Unless they reboot it or release another iteration that somehow combines all the stories of the previous Quake games. Yeah, so Quake is like the last hurrah of a rock supergroup, right? I've just finished reading Masters of Doom by, I forget the author's name, David Kushner. And the book itself, that book is over 20 years old. It was published in 2003. I read it last weekend and it was really compelling. It just followed the careers of John Carmack and John Romero, the two founding fathers of id Software and Doom and Quake. It was really fascinating. People, I feel, maybe idolized John Carmack, and he certainly was the technical mastermind. He was the coding guru who innovated all of these techniques to display visuals, and John Romero would be like the opposite, the more easygoing, creative type. Although he had programming skills as well, he was the more well-rounded developer, having business skills, artistic skills, design skills, in addition to programming skills, whereas John Carmack was pure coding, pure technical, at the expense of maybe people skills. And really, it charts their time meeting, their childhoods, their upbringing. They both were enthralled with early game design, teaching themselves. They met at the software company in Louisiana. In fact, John Romero encouraged John Carmack to join, and they did a side hustle designing games. Eventually they were allowed to do so, and then they split off to their own company. Long story short, they called their company In Demand Games, or ID for short, and then a team member pointed out that id is the pleasure part of the brain in the model proposed by Sigmund Freud. The id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the base level, just focused purely on base instincts. And that really describes the gameplay of Wolfenstein 3D, their first huge hit, then the Doom games, and then the Quake games. But the original Quake was the one that broke up the band, essentially. And I remember probably the impetus for me reading the book, just finding the quote, the infamous quote that Carmack said about stories in video games. Essentially, he compared stories in video games to stories in porn, right? They're expected to be there, but they're not necessary. And that, I wonder if he actually said it, and it's attributed to this book. And to give context, he said it during a pre-production meeting for the game that would become Doom. Not Quake, but Doom, way back before they were building the first Doom. One of the core members of id Software, in addition to John Romero and John Carmack, there was Adrian Carmack, a designer, no relation to John Carmack, and also Tom Hall, who is creative director. Both of those people had come with the two Johns from Softdisk, and Tom was interested in expanding the lore. He put all this effort into creating this Bible for Doom based on Carmack's decision that the game would be like this persistent world rather than having discrete levels played in succession. And I remember Tom Hall wanting to have some kind of sequence in which the main character would be playing cards with their comrades, and then the demon invasion takes place. And that led to Carmack saying that infamous quote. I think in hindsight, it's easy to dunk on him for saying that, but I can see that mindset, certainly at that time. And then Hall ended up scrapping that Bible after Carmack decided, no, it's going to be like one level after another rather than one contiguous world. And it stands out in my mind because Quake, after the band broke up, okay, so fast forward, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but just the build of Quake, just the complexity of it, the achievement, the feat, it's easy to take it for granted now, but it was really difficult for Carmack. It took him more time than anyone expected. They had to poach someone from Michael Abrash from Microsoft to help, if I'm not mistaken. And tensions emerged because by that time, it had been really famous. John Romero was kind of like a rock star, and he was waiting for Carmack to finish the engine first before he started designing. In the meantime, he was focusing on building the id empire, licensing their Doom engine to Raven Software for their Heretic and Hexen games. But the rest of the team was kind of expecting him to do the design aspect. And Carmack, while he was busy developing the engine, he was kind of like, hey, where's Romero? He would normally be at my side, giving me ideas, experimenting, trying to put my engine into practice. And so that was a major split between the two. Initially, the two Johns had each other's back, right? Romero was like, okay, just be patient. We'll wait until Carmack finishes the engine. He'll do it. And then Carmack was like, hey, Romero isn't slacking. When it's time to design, he will do so. But then it just kind of devolved. Just the tension that emerged. That's probably why each of the 4 episodes in the original Quake is designed by a separate person, separate designer. So if memory serves me correct, there's John Romero, American McGee, Tim Willits, and Sandy Peterson. I remember for the demo, Carmack was like, he said, okay, the demos are going to be Tim Willits' levels. It kind of took everyone by surprise because everyone assumed it would have Romero's, and that's kind of like, I was just so just reading it, I was so it was so tense. I was kind of embarrassed for everybody. Reading the Wikipedia page, Sandy Peterson said that the team really lacked a leader. And I agree. I feel like I almost wish I could be there in time. I would try to be like Don Draper from Mad Men without the philandering, alcoholism, and self-loathing, dread, but just someone who is like has that creative knack, but also that sensible business mindset, right? Romero was busy building the empire to his credit, but he's also kind of like playing a lot of team deathmatch, right? I can appreciate the fact that he was so into playing games. It seems like an obvious thing to say, but not all game designers, from what I've read, have the time to play games or if they enjoy playing games. Carmack, by his admission, would have been one of those people. He was more interested in building engines. Maybe he played games with Romero earlier in their careers, but by that time he was like all coding all the time. But certainly, it's like you've got rock stars, very distinct personalities and strengths and weaknesses, but they're needed like a manager, like someone with the sense to look ahead, right? They needed adult supervision, to sum it up. And so after Quake released, Romero had been split. They fired him. They kind of ambushed him, forced him to resign. He actually surrendered all royalties that he would have gotten from Quake had he stayed on the team. That was part of the agreement that the core four owners had agreed upon when they formed id. Again, the core four would have been John Carmack, John Romero, Tom Hall, and Adrian Carmack. By that time, they also had Sandy Peterson, Tim Willits, American McGee. They brought in, I think, a couple of people from Softdisk, Jay and Kevin. They handled more the business side of things. So hard to keep track. But yeah, certainly like no more than a dozen people. It's the Jeff Bezos philosophy, the founder and CEO of Amazon, his two pizza philosophy. If it takes more than two pizzas to feed your team, then your team is too big, right? You gather them for a meeting, you put an empty chair to represent the customer, order two pizzas, and that should be enough to feed them. If you need more pizzas, then you need to reduce the size of their team. I don't know if that will work so much today. Yeah, like, again, hindsight is 2020, but just looking at that time, that period between Doom 2 and Quake, it's like, I wish I could have gone back in time and told them, hey, you've got a time window of about 3 to 5 years. What's going to happen in that time, or after that time passes, right? The rest of the gaming world is going to catch up. Like, your success has been built upon these technological innovations, groundbreaking changes to the way that visuals are represented, and that's fueled the success of your games, in addition to just the visceral nature of the combat. But it's going to be like movies where it's this uncharted territory, but eventually technology is going to be level. And so, like, what is going to distinguish one game and one company from the next? And that's going to be engagement, story. And look at what happened to Half-Life, right? So after Quake, the first Quake releases, Daikatana gets shoved out of the company, or excuse, not Daikatana, John Romero gets shoved out of the company. He forms Ion Storm to work on Daikatana. And yeah, despite the initial animosity, id Software still agrees to license the Quake engine for him and his company to use, and then they also licensed that Quake engine to other companies. One of them would have been Valve. So they licensed the Quake engine to all of these other companies while Carmack is hard at work building the Quake 2 engine. And they kind of like make fun of these other companies, even though they paid id Software to use their Quake engine. One of those companies, one of those games that they kind of mocking was Half-Life. And then look at what happened, dude. A mega hit that changed the course of gaming, I would argue, or among the games that changed the course of gaming. That time period, like 98, 99, besides Half-Life, there would have been Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, Ocarina of Time, these like story-based games, like memorable lead characters, and in some cases villains. And then after the success of Half-Life 2, the remaining people at id Software is like, we want to make a story-based game like the one that just took our lunch, essentially. But no, at that time, you know, Carmack, he was the engine. He was the least expendable, the most important. And so he kind of dictated the direction of their games. But by that time, they had lost the balance that Carmack had brought. The fun-loving, people-oriented personality. So I recommended Masters of Doom, how two guys created empire and transformed pop culture, written by David Kushner. I think this episode is more of a synopsis of the events covered in that book, but I think it's worth talking about because as gamers, I think most people haven't really developed games, right? We just see it from the outside. We don't really consider the human interaction, in some cases the human toll that goes into making the games that we enjoy, even the ones that change the course of the field, of the medium. I think it's becoming more obvious, like it's entered the consciousness of the gaming public with layoffs and crunch time being more publicized. Yeah. Lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so I was watching this kind of documentary and on YouTube about Quake, the original Quake. And there's a comment from someone who said they were involved with the team. I'll try to find out who it was, but basically they said that era of id Software was like a strip of magnesium. If you've ever done a science experiment involving magnesium in high school, it's this material, this element that when lit, it just lets off this blindingly bright flash. I'm pretty sure it's the material used in flashbang grenades, but it's so bright, but then it disappears. It's bright but brief. There's a tongue twister, and that's really the impact of id Software in the mid to late 90s, right? 4 mega hits, and then just kind of went on a downward slope. I think in the book, there's only one actual comparison to the company being a band. I think it's Adrian Carmack who brings it up when at the time John Carmack is thinking of, after they finish Quake 2, his decision is to go back or reboot Doom 3. And I remember at the time the announcement of Doom 3 had been a big deal. The graphics were pretty amazing, but again, it was just id Software under the direction of John Carmack going back to that well, relying on very simplistic gameplay and just believing that technical innovation was the key to their success. And then going back to what I was saying earlier, Adrian Carmack was like, why would we do that? It'd be like a big time rock band going back and redoing their first album just because they can do it better. And that was him voicing his frustration with id Software going back to that, well, just doing the same thing. And the book, the author mentions that as well, that general sentiment among the gaming public. And that's really the sense that I got, like that era of id Software. They're like a mega rock band, but they needed adult supervision. Yeah. Quake. What was I gonna say? So id Software is still around. Doom, the next Doom game is going to be released next year. I'm kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Cautiously optimistic. I played Doom 16. Finally, there was a story. I didn't think it was that engaging. About 2/3 of the way through, I just kind of lost interest, but I played to the end. I got the platinum. Doom Eternal, I know, as I mentioned, there's more lore building, lore exploration. Even it doesn't always hit the mark with everybody. But for me, I think it's just like the complicated juggling of resources that's really off-putting. That's discouraging me from playing that game, but who knows, I might give it a shot. But going back to John Carmack, I know people are gonna, it's easy to take that quote, that infamous quote, out of context, but as I've read more about the inspiration for Quake, it's not like he didn't have an appreciation or even capacity for storytelling or world building. Like early in the game, early in the book, their careers, them transitioning from soft disk in Louisiana to, I think, id Software. A regular thing that the team would do is play Dungeons and Dragons. And they would play this campaign that John Carmack had built up. And they did it every week, it seemed like, for over the course of several years. And Quake was, I think, a character in that D&D campaign. And then there was this mythical sword, Daikatana, and that ended up being the inspiration, part of inspiration for John Romero's game when he got pushed out of id Software. But if you play the official expansions for Quake, you kind of see that the original inspiration for Quake. I guess, like, so hard to keep track, but I think as originally envisioned, Quake was the name of a D&D character who had a hammer that could spew lightning like Thor. And there actually is a lightning hammer in the one of the official expansions for Quake. The ones from the 90s, and there's like a shield and this like horn thing, so there is kind of like this Viking-like aesthetic. Again, hindsight is 2020, but if id Software had like maybe kind of changed the course of Quake a bit more, like while Carmack was building that original Quake engine, Romero and Tom Hall and the rest of the team could have built out that world, focus more on like fleshing out that universe instead of just having, you know, end of episode text messages. They might have changed the course of the company. They might still be there instead of just like essentially glorified tech demos. that didn't really innovate in terms of like gameplay or storytelling. Maybe it's a hot take, I don't know. But I think the fact that Quake isn't really up there with COD these days. Well, you could say the same for Half-Life and Halo. First-person shooters, first-person franchises, they do tend to have a limited shelf life of maybe 5 to 7 years, with the exception of COD that's still going strong, but I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, it might be on the downslope. So that's my rambling about Quake. Just kind of spewing all the information, echoing the information that I've absorbed about the game. But one thing I like about how the book covers is that, you know, I never get the sense that there's any long-standing animosity. Right? I think it ends with an anecdote from QuakeCon. QuakeCon, okay. Aside from QuakeCon, the convention, bring your own computer deathmatch. Obviously, those hardcore fans, but I'm talking about in like the general gaming public. Quake is never going to be at the level that it had been at its peak. But going back to the end of the book, it's like Carmack's car is having trouble starting, so it's Romero who's bringing his jumper cables, right? I never get the sense that they actually hate each other. Kind of like McCartney and Lennon. I think that combination, that comparison is made somewhere in the book, or maybe I read it somewhere else, but it's just two friends, deep respect for each other, complementing each other's skills. In some cases, they have similar skills, but maybe one has better experience or a better knack for that domain compared to the other. But even after the split, you know, it's like they're still kind of like sort of friends, frenemies. You know, I would love to just be in a room with the two of them, and maybe even, well, just the two of them, and then just kind of like talk, you know, what would you do differently, and so on, and then maybe talk with the other team members. It's not just those two guys. Certainly they're the two founding fathers, but the other key members as well. Ask them if they have regrets. Yeah, I kind of look at them like my two uncles. I never met them, right? I grew up playing those games. And yeah, Quake. I think of those two guys, those two designers, and also my friend who raving about that character, Ranger. Yeah, I would have liked to see them flesh out that character a bit more. So that's Quake. Consider giving it a shot. I don't know if it's available in VR. If you can find someone to play with who can sit through the OG Quake, or if you got like a podcast or show that you can binge while playing it, give it a shot, certainly. Really experience a piece of gaming history, and maybe not be too saddened about what might have been. Also, if you get a chance, read Masters of Doom. I don't get any like cut of the sales of that book, but it'd be nice if I did. Alright, actually, forget that part. Yeah, so I'm just rambling, as I am inclined to do, but Quake, piece of gaming history, for sure.